This is Thinking in Public, a program dedicated to intelligent conversation about frontline theological and cultural issues with the people who are shaping them. I'm Albert Mohler, your host and president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. Ryan T. Anderson is the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, which is an institute, a think tank devoted to the intersection between Christian morality and issues of public policy. Prior to his role at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, Dr. Anderson, who earned his PhD from the University of Notre Dame, served as the William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. His research has been cited by the United States Supreme Court. His scholarship has made significant contributions on the issues of marriage, religious freedom, and sexuality, among others. His most recent book, When Harry Became Sally, Responding to the Transgender Moment, was the topic of a previous episode of Thinking in Public. But today, we'll be talking about a range of issues. Ryan Anderson, welcome to Thinking in Public.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be back with you.
Well, I'm really glad to have this conversation, and I think there are some really interesting questions we can get into. The first of them really occasioned by the fact that you are now the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. That's a part of the vast array of think tanks and similar organizations in the city of Washington, D.C. And I think as listeners to Thinking in Public try to understand the world around us, I think that very compound think tank is something that plays an outsized role in American public life and intellectual life. So let's just kind of trace the history, and then we'll talk about what the Ethics and Public Policy Center actually does.
Yeah, that sounds great to me. So EPPC, when we were started in 1976, so the bicentennial year, my old institution, I used to be at the Heritage Foundation. It was started in 73. And there are several, center-right think tanks that started in the 70s. EPPC was the only one, to my knowledge, that was explicitly Judeo-Christian, right up in front of what, the DNA is of the organization, is that we're explicitly pro-Bible and we're pro-America. And we think those two things have something to say to each other, right? We think there's something about a Christian influence to America. Not that we're a Christian nation in the way some people might misconstrue what I'm saying there, but also not that we are a secularist.
Right. And there is no honest explanation for the culture of the United States of America, its systems and laws and constitutional government, other than a commitment to at least a Christian understanding of reality and humanity, looking back at the founding of this nation. But let me push back a little bit further. So if we were to go back into the 19th century, no one would know what a think tank was.
Right.
By the time you get to the end of the 20th century, the left and the right and virtually all points in between have think tanks. And so I want to offer a thesis and then ask you to respond to it. My thesis is that the think tanks became necessary with the vast explosion in policy that took place in the 20th century, both in Europe and in the United States. And that policy had to come from somewhere. And so the ideas and actual policy proposals often came out of these organizations. I think the most interesting ones, by the way, are in Britain and in the United States that were called think tanks. Is that pretty much how this got started?
I think that's largely accurate, is that, as you had the rise of the administrative state. So you need more and more experts doing that. Right. But then also as you had, more and more legislation, right? The New Deal, the Great Society, you needed experts to staff that. And so there's almost something, some of the think tanks were kind of like revolving doors of an administration would go into office. And then when they were no longer in power, they would spend 4 years at a think tank and then go back in office and then 4 years back. And I had a bunch of old colleagues at Heritage who, they decamped, served the country in the Trump administration. And now they're, going back to Heritage, or they're going to other similar institutions.
Now, I'm going to argue in a few moments that the Trump administration was something of an anomaly to the established pattern. But it was the left that really pioneered the think tank, not the right. And so you had the rise of organizations, I guess in the United States, the one that people might think of the most would be the Brookings Institution. And Brookings really was kind of an artifact of the vast expansion of government in the administrative state. And I think what people, even whether liberals or conservatives in America today, I think few of them understand that much of the legislation that eventually gets considered and ultimately adopted by Congress doesn't originate in some congressional office. It originates in a think tank, which is usually a nonprofit institution that has a very clear political identity.
And I think that's true on a couple of levels. I mean, sometimes like this, the initial concept, the idea behind the legislation will be something that was cooked up by a think tank fellow somewhere.
Right.
Sometimes the first draft of the actual legislation is written by a think tank fellow somewhere who then shops around to different Senate offices or House offices to find the sponsor. And then a lot of the defense of that legislation is picked up by think tanks. So almost those three different levels of, the initial concept, the actual legislative text, and then the public, shaping the public debate surrounding that text. These institutions play an important role in a kind of American democracy in helping think through what should our laws be, which also means you can't sit out that debate, right? You can't be on the sidelines, because it's not as if, if we didn't do our part, the other side would stop doing theirs. No, Brookings would still be here. The Center for American Progress, these are going to be in existence. And so the question for conservatives and the question for biblically orthodox believers is, are we going to be participants in that discussion? Yes or no?
Well, as we're having this conversation, the Biden administration is within its first 100 days. And it has been strikingly successful in political terms in achieving many of its stated goals, even more than the candidate appears to have thought possible. And I would argue that a lot of that has to do with the fact that they're not coming up with anything like the American Rescue Act, as they called it. It was already largely shaped out by the Center for American Progress, which I think right now is probably the most dominant think tank in the background of the Biden administration. So much so that Nina Tanden, who was the head of, or I guess still is the head of the Center for American Progress, was tapped to be the head of the Office of Management and Budget, a failed nomination, but nonetheless symbolic of the fact that one organization's at the center of producing policy. And just in recent days, there's been conversation about a $3 trillion infrastructure bill that the Biden administration is going to be proposing. Well, they haven't had time to come up with a $3 trillion legislative package. That existed before there was a Biden nomination.
Yep, that's exactly right. And this is what's important for, most of our listeners and viewers, because my guess is that they aren't Biden supporters. That stuff is happening now to prepare for 2024.
Yep.
Right now, the campaign for 2024 started this past November.
The campaign of ideas, for sure.
Well, I think both the campaign for ideas and I think the jockeying for position. I think you've already seen different public figures jockeying for position to be the candidate. And that means we need to be playing that long game. We need to be realizing that we are shifting Overton windows one way or the other in terms of what is plausible, what is possible.
So the think tank, as a British and American institution, was really pioneered by the left on both sides of the Atlantic. And that had to do with the fact that the left already dominated in the academic culture. And so these were policy people that kind of stepped in and out of academia, in and out of government. But they had extraordinary cohesiveness and indeed comprehensiveness in their plans. The Brookings Institution was kind of famous for having a plan for everything. And if they didn't have a plan for something, they could come up with it in 90 days. That was just kind of the legend of the Brookings Institution. And it had such intellectual authority that if Brookings was put on something, say in the last half of the 20th century, then especially on the left, well, okay, then this is our policy. This is us. But I became a teenage conservative in the United States in the 1970s, and really trying to get the lay of the land. And the conservative movement in the United States, and then the conservative movement in Britain, had periodicals. We had National Review. We had similar kinds of institutions. But it was the development of conservative think tanks that really changed the equation. And it was seen, first of all, in Great Britain, where conservative think tanks, and one in particular, really became associated with Margaret Thatcher, developing the ideas that became known as Thatcherism and the recovery of the British economy, and a new assertiveness of Britain on the world stage. And at the same time, just to fast forward, when Ronald Reagan on January the 20th of 1981, takes the oath of office. He already has the famous notebooks from the Heritage Foundation that not only had policies, but 1,400, I think it was, staffers, mapped out. That's something that no conservative in the United States had ever had before.
Yeah, it was, I'm trying to remember the exact name, The Mandate for Leadership.
That's right.
That was the book. And back when I was at Heritage, there were certain bookshelves that were just full of, the 1980s edition, 1982, 1984. And they were big, thick books. And it had all of the various policy proposals. And for each policy proposal, there was a matching piece of legislation that embodied the policy. And then at a certain point, they started creating the kind of like personnel handbooks. And I know some of my former colleagues at Heritage, they were working on the transition team, identifying, who should be staffing the Trump administration and trying to identify, serious conservatives who are also both committed to the principles and had the right expertise, because it really does require a certain amount of expertise to run various agencies.
It certainly does. And having that lack of expertise is disastrous, as administrations of both parties have found.
Yes.
But the dependence upon these think tanks is huge. By the way, I did not mean to mention this, but in one of the kind of hilarious moments in which think tank Washington shows up and no one knows what just happened, I'm thinking of the famous comment, or that was infamous, that was made by then Republican nominee Mitt Romney when he was asked about his appointment of women in a prospective Romney administration. And he said, I have notebooks of women, to appoint. And people made fun of that. But actually, he had notebooks, and that's what all these nominees have. Just in anticipation of the election, they all have these vast notebooks for the thousands of appointed positions. And so, I mean, it was politically a stupid statement to make, but it was actually a statement of fact. And the reality is Barack Obama had notebooks too. He just didn't talk about them.
He was a better politician in that respect.
He understood that having the notebooks and talking about the notebooks are politically two different things.
Yes.
But no administration, given the size of the administrative state, I mean, you're looking at well over 1,000 Senate confirmation positions now. And you understand that no one can be elected president of the United States and walk in and have an administration within 2 years without someone doing all that background work. And here's the question I want to pose to you. Why is it that the parties don't do that? That's what the parties did in the early 20th century. Why did the think tanks take over what the political parties used to do?
That is a question above my pay grade. I mean, I can't even, give you a guess as to that answer. Actually, I will give you a guess. And I think part of it could be that the think tank was committed to an ideology, whereas the party might have been more committed to electoral success.
No, that's exactly it.
The think tanks were trying to push the party in the right direction, given the belief system. And I'm not using ideology as like a smear. I'm just saying everyone has an ideology. And I think I can just, speak from experience at Heritage. Heritage was trying to push the Republican Party in a certain direction. And sometimes the priorities and the values of the party and the priorities and the values of the movement might be at odds. And that's going to be true for EPPC. We have a certain ideology, again, not in a pejorative sense, but, we want to see the Republican Party move in our direction. We want to put pressure on the party to move it in our direction. So I don't know historically if that's the reason why, the think tanks started doing things that the party used to. But I know today in practice, that's how it works.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. And I think looking at Britain first, because these things happened in many ways in Britain first, given their system of government and a parliamentary government in which a prime minister has to put together an entire government, upon taking office. I think it was a division of labor, just as you say, where the party became assigned to win elections.
Yep.
And the think tanks sought to win ideas. And so even in that division of labor, many of the campaign themes and slogans and arguments don't emerge from the parties anymore. They emerge from the think tanks that have just incredible access to the candidates, and the candidates are dependent upon them. On the right, let's talk about the constellation. So the Heritage wasn't the first think tank. It was just the first think tank to have that kind of influence, right?
Yeah, I mean, so the story that Ed Fulner, the past president of Heritage, would always tell us is that, Heritage started as a kind of breakaway from AEI because there was a big vote on the Hill, and then everyone got a copy of an AEI report like the day after the vote. And someone said, like, why didn't you give it to us ahead of time? And they were like, oh, well, we wouldn't want to influence how you voted. And people are like, well, then why are we doing this? If we aren't trying to, influence concrete outcomes, have impact, what are we doing? And so this is where, there have been different models of think tanks. And some people say there's the university without students model, where, you're just the researcher and you just think great thoughts and you have your big ideas. And then there's also a model where the think tank is more of a do tank. Right. And I once had a boss at Heritage that referred to Heritage this way as a do tank. And the idea is that we're trying to get stuff done. We have ideas and we think about things, but at the service of, concrete outcomes. What I like about EPPC is that it strikes me as the perfect blend of both of those things. Right. It's the university without students, where our scholars, have time to do the deep research and the thinking that's necessary, but it's all at the service of some bottom line outcomes, right? We're trying to influence both the culture and public policy, and those things are related. It's important to point out. Yeah. And so it takes some time to do your homework, do the research, do the scholarship, but then it also takes time to do something with that knowledge, right? It's not just to puff yourself up, it's to equip people for the battles that need to be engaged.
Yeah, now you are inside the Beltway, and it showed when you just said AEI. You're talking about the American Enterprise Institute. And that raises a very interesting question, because I began with Heritage intentionally. But before Heritage was AEI, and the American Enterprise Institute, funded by big business largely originally, was created as an alternative to the Brookings Institution. And so you had Brookings on the left, but I'll say center left, very, very much in the center of Democratic party life. And then you had a center right think tank, the American Enterprise Institute. But I'm not sure it's fair to call it conservative at all anymore. I know that could be contentious, but they have some conservative scholars. But AEI and Brookings, they're at least in similar territory now, right?
Well, so I think that might be a little unfair to AEI. And partly with the arrival of Yuval Levin in particular. Yeah. And I wouldn't just say the arrival of Yuval, but AEI, if you look historically, that was the think tank where Michael Novak was a scholar. Absolutely. That was the think tank where Leon Kass was a scholar. Yes. That was a think tank where Irving Kristol was a scholar.
Three heroic figures in conservative intellectual life. And
currently Yuval Levin is there. Yeah. Adam White is there. Yeah. Ramesh Panuru's there, Tim Carney's there. And so, I think you're right in saying the general center of gravity for the American Enterprise Institute was always on free enterprise, right? Their bread and butter was much more free market capitalism, free trade, low taxes. Like that's what motivated their core of gravity, their center of gravity. Yeah. And that's going to be different than an institution like Ethics and Public Policy Center, right? What motivates us is going to be much more some of the ethical questions that lie at the heart of our politics. And we're in favor of markets. We defend private property, but that's not probably the existential questions for us. Those aren't the existential questions for us.
Yeah. So I meant to be provocative with that question, and I provoked what I was looking for there. And I think you make some very good points. By the way, I think Yuval Levin is one of the most important public intellectuals in the United States today. I've done thinking in public conversations with him, and we'll look forward to doing that again. But it also points out the fact that many of these think tanks have different silos, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And so you've got kind of the cultural piece, you've got the economic piece, increasingly a foreign policy piece, and things like that. I've had the privilege of working with several of these think tanks, including at times EPPC and also Heritage on events. I've been a part of a lot of Heritage meetings and conferences, and I will tell you, it's reassuring to know that there are still places where ideas really matter.
Mm.
And I think that's important for Christians understanding this society in our times, to understand that ideas don't just appear out of the ether, and policies certainly derive from those ideas do not. It takes nourishing ideas. It takes honoring intellectual contribution. It takes a commitment to research and writing. And frankly, the conservative movement in the United States was not famous for that, partly because it was the other side that was pushing all the policies. It was the other side in the mid 20th century that was pushing the ideas. So this has been something of a conservative response.
I think that's right. Is that if you look at the rise of especially the modern conservative movement, right? Yeah. This was Bill Buckley, standing athwart history, yelling "Stop!" Right? It seemed as if during mid-century, early to mid-century, all of the force of momentum was with the progressives, right? You get the New Deal, you get the Great Society, Buckley's standing athwart history, yelling "Stop!" But then you also get the Reagan Revolution, right? And some of the ideas, you have Goldwater's campaign, you have the founding of National Review, you have the founding of the Heritage Foundation in '73, and then a decade later, right? These ideas are now coming to fruition. They're being advanced in policy. Now we can then debate how successful the conservative movement has been. What have we conserved, right? I mean, I think that's a fair question. I don't discount some of the critics who are saying, look, for all of the money, all of the energy, all of the ideas, it seems like in 2021 we're actually worse off than we were in 1980s on especially many of the things that you and I care most about, but many of the cultural and moral questions.
Yeah, and we're certainly going to be talking about those in this conversation. And I wanted to kind of lay a foundation for getting there. And a part of that foundation is to look at how think tanks and ideas operate, the centrality of ideas to a culture. And this is something that conservatives have really always understood. Classical conservatism, going back to Burke, it was the preservation of ideas and structures, truths and virtues, ways of life and orders of living without which human happiness wasn't going to take place. Human flourishing wasn't going to happen. And Buckley, as you said, starting National Review to stand athwart history and cry halt, he admitted at times it wasn't really halt, it was slow down. The effect of conservatism has been to slow down radical social and moral change and to ameliorate it. And Burke understood that. Burke understood that, for instance, in the French Revolution, passions have been set loose that were just not going to be extinguished, but they needed to be channeled in directions that would actually be helpful to humanity. So there's a sense in which you have 1980 to 2020. That's a lot of my adult lifespan right there. And I'm not going to argue that things have gotten better morally.
No, and I have two thoughts. Just kind of. In reaction to what you just said there. And one is that when you look at how conservatives have invested in ideas,
right?
Especially think about social conservatives and theological conservatives. We have good seminary programs, and yours would obviously be an example of that. We have good legal training, things like the Federalist Society or Alliance Defending Freedom. We have lots of economics, right? There's all sorts of free market economists. Right. What we don't have is kind of the social conservative, social science, social conservative philosophy, and public policy, right? There's not a pipeline producing, that next generation of scholar who's going to be doing some of the public policy work on social issues, the way that we do have it for lawyers and we have it for economists. And we have it for theological education, right? But we don't quite have it for the public policy implications of that. And so I think that's one area where, because we didn't make enough investments on the ideas, we're seeing the consequence. The other is to say that while ideas matter in this area, Richard Weaver's right, ideas have consequences.
Absolutely.
I think we also are seeing, and we just saw this week in South Dakota, that we also need political muscle. Right? We had a good idea. We had a good piece of legislation. And then a governor caved to big business. And I think here is something that social conservatives in particular, there's a club for growth
Right.
and there's the NRA. These are both large, well-funded political machines that if the governor of South Dakota betrayed them on Second Amendment rights or on an economic agenda, they would come in and make their presence known.
Yes.
Social conservatives, we don't have a club for virtue. We don't have an NRA for the family. And I think that's why we saw Indiana RFRA go the way it did. We saw the North Carolina bathroom bill. And, luckily he stood up to the bullies, but, the NBA and other, and now we saw South Dakota.
He stood up mostly to the bullies.
Right.
He did
the best he could, given the cavalry wasn't coming. Right.
I acknowledge that. And I'll defend the former governor and vice president in the political context. But the reality is it tells us very bad news about America that in a state like Indiana, you could not get the same bill that passed unanimously in the House in 1993 through the Indiana legislature. But you actually hit something that's very, very important to me here. And as we think about this, Ryan, I think there's a reason why there isn't a club for virtue. And I think it's because the people who are paying for the club for growth and who are paying for, in many ways, other think tanks on foreign policy or national policy, and especially supporting big business, they don't want to be associated with a club for virtue. Right. I mean, that's where we are right now. And so I've been a part for 40 years of trying to help bring together something like a club for virtue. And we're sold out by others, supposedly in the conservative movement.
This is it's the biggest nut that I need to crack in terms of how do you persuade the socially conservative philanthropist to invest that money wisely, because diversifying between all of the center right groups, I'm going to help them all out a little bit. You might actually be canceling out your own philanthropy because some of these groups are working at cross purposes. Yeah, and if my sense is that if it isn't explicitly socially conservative, it's probably not going to be advancing our ball down the field 5, 10, 15 years from now.
So
donors need to think about that.
You are making a point that is central to my entire understanding of life and leadership, which is if you do not make these issues public up front, you're not going to be faithful in whispering them behind closed doors either. And that's where I think we're seeing a lot of the cleavage, because the historic conservative movement in the United States, if you go back to the 80s, was I think rightly described as a fusion of free market capitalists and conservative libertarians and conservative Christians largely. And the problem is that many of us among conservative Christians understood that the other two would elbow us out when it was convenient. And so just to take the LGBTQ revolution, that's what we're feeling right now. I mean, there are an awful lot of those in the other two legs of the stool, for example, who just want to get past these issues, by the way, as if you could.
I think that's exactly right. And I mean, many of us who have unfortunately, I've been in DC now for almost a decade, are acutely aware of how tenuous some of those coalitions are. And how unrealistic or kind of unrepresentative the DC phenomenon is compared to the rest of the globe. There was that great scatter plot that came out in 2016 of Trump voters, and it had it on two axes. One was economic views and one was social views. And the DC quadrant, the socially progressive, fiscally conservative, was empty. There are no voters who actually agree with the DC consultant class of fiscally conservative, socially liberal. All of the red dots were north of the equator, which meant they were socially conservative. And then they were more or less evenly spread between economically conservative and economically liberal, which was to say that it's more or less a populist economic agenda.
That's right.
With a socially conservative cultural agenda. Yeah. And we don't have enough intellectual leadership promoting that, embodying that. And that's what I hope EPBC is going to be doing. Is what I hope more of the organizations center right will do, because that's where the voters are. And it's what accords with human nature and human flourishing. Like that sort of a policy agenda is going to make us, it's going to make us flourish.
Well, I can only say amen to that. And as a theologian, I have a theological answer for why that is so. I know the same scatter diagram you're talking about. And of course, it didn't surprise you. It didn't surprise me. And furthermore, when you talk about the economic issues, I'm going to argue that that's almost, it's not irrelevant, but it's more irrelevant than the Washington class would like to think. The primary issues motivating those voters are cultural and moral, and no apologies for that. And the economics are what seems to make most sense as the economics appear in a candidate reflecting their cultural concerns and their moral concerns. So, it's not as if you have the average so let's just take the famous study that was done about 2015 or so and updated. The Trump voters tended to be very near a Cracker Barrel, and the Obama voters and later Clinton and Biden voters tended to be closer to a Whole Foods. Well, the thing is that conservatives are not at Cracker Barrel trying to figure out exactly where they stand on tax policy. They are not at Cracker Barrel thinking primarily about their concerns about their grandchildren and free trade. I'm not saying those are not relevant issues, but that is not what they're thinking about. And I promise you that's true because I get to preach to them every Sunday.
Oh, I think that's exactly right. Like, look, most of us, when we think about our kids, I don't care if he's rich or if he's poor. I don't care if she's going to be, a great entrepreneur or is just going to have an ordinary day job. Right? I mean, what most people want is that they don't want to see a return of bread lines and gas lines. And so long as, we keep the economy basically going well, most people don't have a dog in the fight of like how you micromanage it to get there. But what they care about is like, is my child going to be morally corrupted at school? Right. Is the government-run public school system going to indoctrinate my kid? Is the broader culture, like I want my children to grow up to be saints, right? I want my kids to grow up to love Jesus and then to live with him forever in heaven. Right. And that's the existential question that's motivating people.
And on earth, you want your children, you want your son to grow up and marry a woman and have children. And, it's just normal things that have driven the entire human species from Adam and Eve. Those first concerns are cultural and moral because that's where existence begins. That's where ontology begins. That's where Genesis begins. I just want to affirm that.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, the pathway that we want is for our sons and our daughters to grow up to be men and women, to then assume the responsibilities for a vocation of being a husband or a wife, to then be a mom or a dad. And yes, like there needs to be dignified work to help pay the bills, but that's not where most people find the greatest joy in life. Most people find the greatest joy in life around the kitchen table, right? That's playing wiffle ball in the backyard. It's family life, right? And then it's church life, right? And I think we speak a lot about economic life and we don't talk enough, think enough, and craft policies around our family life and our religious life. And I think we need to get those back into the center of the discussion.
I had the honor of meeting with President George W. Bush several times and being with him, praying before he spoke at a major event and praying with him in the aftermath of 9/11. And so a great respect for President Bush. But when I think about the second administration of George W. Bush, I think about the fact that he said he wanted to channel the momentum of his election into Social Security reform. And I remember thinking, he's president, but I think this is the greatest missed opportunity in American history. Because what's driving America is not they're waking up every morning worried about Social Security reform. They're worried about what kind of nation we're going to be. And, what we have not had are candidates, I think, who understand that from the Republican mainstream. And I think the most interesting question for 2024 is whether someone will emerge along those lines.
And I think you already see that with someone like Marco Rubio, someone like Tom Cotton, someone like Josh Hawley. I think all three of those senators are self-consciously trying to rethink what does conservatism in the 2020s look like. And they're not rejecting what conservatism looked like in the 1980s, but they're saying that, a living tradition develops, right? It's
Right.
not kind of stagnant once and all in time and place, but that the challenges that we had to face in the 1980s are different than the
Right.
challenges we have to face today. And so let's apply perennial principles to today's challenges and not treat the particular policies of the 80s as if those were our actual principles. I think that's the mistake, is when we treat, particular applications as if they're the foundational principles.
Right. And if you go back to the Social Security example, President Bush didn't get his Social Security reform. And one of the reasons he didn't get it is that he thought people had elected him to do it. Mm-hmm. And it turned out that his own voters didn't care much about it. And that's not to say it wasn't important. I actually think his reform proposals would have been very good for the nation and good for Social Security and good for human flourishing. But it was a misreading of the political impulses. And I think the conservative movement, kind of writ large in Washington right now, is following the same example in the main. They are looking for explanations of what conservative voters want, while largely ignoring what conservative voters have been telling them that they want.
Yeah. And a good example of someone who seems to be getting this, and I mentioned earlier the three senators. Here's a fourth senator, Mitt Romney.
Yes.
The Mitt Romney of 2021
very different.
Is very different than the Mitt Romney who said he was a severe conservative, and 47% of Americans were the takers, the makers and the takers. I mean, he's introduced the most generous federal plan as a pro-family, pro-child tax bill. Look, we can debate the intricacies, and there's an interesting debate between Romney and Mike Lee's office and Romney and Marco Rubio's office on this, and that's great. But it shows that Romney learned something from the past 8 years and was saying, look, what people care about is, will it be affordable to have kids? Right. And what can policymakers do to make it more affordable to have kids?
Well, and one of the things that's changed is that we have irrefutable evidence of a absence of births that actually does threaten American civilization.
Yes, this is where I think sometimes the label of nationalism conjures up bad kind of images, but the basic idea is that every community has a common good. And there's the community known as your family, and there's a common good of your family. There's a community known as your church. There's a common good of your church. There's also a community known as your nation, and there's a common good of the nation. And so the thinkers who are gathering under the label of nationalists and nationalism, they're saying we got to be thinking about what's the common good of our nation, what policies promote that. And natalism is a part of that. If we don't have enough people, enough citizens, then the nation isn't going to flourish. And so I take all of these developments as signs of health, that, our side of the divide is willing to have these discussions, have these debates. And I think eventually it's going to get us to a better place. Because I don't think, just keeping where we are, I don't think that's the solution.
No. And, there are debates about, for instance, whether or not policy A or B would have the desired results. I think everyone would agree. Every person of goodwill would agree. We want to have more babies. We want to have more healthy babies, more flourishing families. The question is how to get there. You raise an issue that we're not going to have time to unpack, but you dare to speak of the nation, and I do too. And theologically, I believe the nation is quite justified as a unit. In just a providential understanding of history, there's been far more peace in the world with the development of the nation state than there was before the development of the nation state. There's nothing in the Bible about the nation state, but there is about peoples and ethnicities. And I don't mean that just racially, but just understanding to whom you belong. What is our family that we're trying to build here? And by the way, we hope for other families also to be built up. There's nothing theologically defined about the borders of the United States of America, but it turns out that declaring oneself a citizen of the world doesn't lead to human flourishing, because it turns out that I think a biblical worldview affirms that it's concrete relationships that actually build human flourishing, not abstract.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just how we have to think about this at all levels of our lives. Like, I'm a member of my family, But that doesn't mean that my family is better than your family. That doesn't mean that, like, I don't care about your family, but it means I prioritize my family's flourishing over your family's flourishing. It means I play a particular role in my family's flourishing that I don't play for your family's flourishing. It means that as I pursue my family's flourishing, I want to do it in ways that are compatible with your family's flourishing. But I'm certainly not going to prioritize feeding your kids before I feed my kids. I'm not going to tuck your kids into bed at night at all, but I am going to tuck my kids into bed. That's something that the nation state and just every political community, right? Because I don't think it just needs to be nations, like your city, your state. I live in a village. My city is so small, it's classified as a village, not even yet a city, but those particular connections matter, right? We have a universal ethic that gets lived out with particularities, particular relationships. And I think the tension between universality and particularity, it's all throughout Christian theology, and it needs to be wrestled with, that tension of both the universal and the particular.
But that identity comes down to matters of language and allegiance to certain laws and institutions, the recognition of legitimate government. So, for example, during the 20th century, I mean, frankly, going back to the Enlightenment, but in the 20th century, there was this great hope for a more global sense of identity, and the result of that is nobody's kids get tucked in at night. But and so you look at, for instance, the League of Nations and its failure, the United Nations, and frankly, its farcical character. And you look at the fact that in the European Union now, which is supposed to be just a European superstate, it turns out that Polish people really do care about being Polish, and German people really do care about being German. And even right now in the COVID-19 crisis and all the rest, Angela Merkel, I think, has finally kind of figured out she's got to be responsible for the people of Germany, and even on vaccine policy, in a way that their own kind of internationalist outlook said shouldn't be the concern.
Yep, and you see this in the church, even with if I'm the pastor of this church, these are the people that I'm committed to, right?
That's right.
And there's still a universal church. I mean, we definitely do have some disagreements about how we think about the universal church and ecclesiology, but we at least have enough agreement that there is a universal church and there are particular churches, and the pastor's role is going to be to ministering to that particular flock. And that's not to somehow denigrate the other flocks. I mean, this is where, it's in our ecclesiology. It should also be in our political theology and our political philosophy. Yeah.
I will simply say, as a Baptist, we could put it this way. We believe that there are churches beyond my church.
Yes.
And the EPPC, just thinking about it, the Ethics and Public Policy Center, you're Christian, but you're not confessional in the sense that you're not Protestant Catholic, although you've had both involved. So you had prominent Roman Catholics involved in the EPPC. You also had my friend and mentor, Dr. Carl F.H. Henry, very much involved in the beginning with EPPC. And it's public policy, but the first word's ethics. And the more I think about it, Ryan, the more astounding that is to me. Ethics is the first word.
And that was intentional. I mean, so when EPPC was started, it was started right at the kind of right when Rawlsianism was probably getting its greatest stranglehold on our country. The idea that laws were supposed to be morally neutral, that you could only speak with public reason.
No comprehensive theories.
No comprehensive doctrines, none of that, right? And EPPC was like, no, every piece of legislation, every law embodies someone's worldview. It flows out of someone's morality. And the only question is going to be, is it true morality or false morality? But you're not going to get a morally neutral marriage law, right? The marriage laws that we have are either going to embody the truth about marriage or a falsehood.
You're not going to have a morally neutral tax law or zoning law.
Private property, that's a moral value, right? Everything. And this is where, sometimes you have to remind a certain type of libertarian who thinks that you can have moral neutrality, that it's really an illusion.
Try taking their property and their argument changes.
Exactly. That they have a moral view. I mean, I think libertarians, it's a misguided moral view because I think liberty is the only moral value that matters for politics. I think there are lots of things that matter for politics. Liberty is one of them, but it's not the only one. And what EBPC is meant to do is really highlight those ethical concerns. In the previous decade, the major focus was on bioethics. Many of the George W. Bush Council on Bioethics thinkers decamped the White House and came to EBPC. And they had been students of Leon Kass. And, this is where they kind of got their professional start in life. The challenges today are a little bit different. We're focusing a lot right now just because of the legislative calendar on the Equality Act.
Right.
And one of our fellows just last week testified. She was one of the two expert witnesses on our side of that issue. And so I'm proud to, have great colleagues who are willing to kind of speak out when it's unpopular. Like no one is making friends or, getting rich off of opposition to the Equality Act, but it's the morally right thing to do.
I want to ask you a direct question here. I've been giving a lot of attention to the Equality Act for years because after all, it was first articulated in 1973. And forms of it were very much a part of conversation back right as same-sex marriage was being dealt with by the Supreme Court. And so it was kind of like this was clearly understood to be the next thing. And coming down the line. But when it comes to something like the Equality Act, it poses a direct threat to the existence of an organization like the Ethics and Public Policy Center.
True. And for that matter, to the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. I mean,
to be blunt. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I'm making it very clear about the existence of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary and Boyce College and the Southern Baptist Convention in our churches. But I think there are a lot of conservatives who don't understand without this, there is no, as currently constituted, EPPC or much of the program of the Heritage Foundation or the ability to have a Grove City College and Hillsdale College and well, you can just name any Baptist, evangelical university. They just go away.
But here's what's most remarkable about that. The way you just told the history was that, when the Supreme Court was, quote, settling the marriage issue on our behalf, the legislative piece of, the policy there was ENDA, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. And know this history, that originally all that the request was for employment non-discrimination. It was only, I think now 5 or 6 years ago that was morphed into every title of the Civil Rights Act would now be amended, not just Title VII, the employment non-discrimination part, but it would be Title II for public accommodations, Title VI for federal funding. And originally it only included sexual orientation.
Right.
And it was a dozen years ago that gender identity was added.
That's right.
And at the time, no one had any idea what gender identity meant. Right? Still, many Americans a decade ago had no idea what the T in LGBT stood for. And so,
and it didn't stand for one word because more than one T word was used within that community at the time.
Yes. Did it mean
transsexual and transgender?
Transgender? No, exactly. And the reason I highlight this is to show how quickly the demands have evolved.
Yeah. And they're not finished.
At all.
Yeah.
And the one caution here is that when you mentioned it threatens the very existence of something like EBPC or the existence of Boyce College and the Southern
as constituted.
It shouldn't therefore lead us as a response to say, then what we need is some religious liberty exemptions to protect our institutions while the bad law gets imposed on everyone else, right? I think that's a bad way of thinking about this. What we want to say is that the law itself is unjust. And it's not just unjust for you and me, not just unjust for your institution and my institution. It's unjust for everyone. And therefore, we have to defeat it whole hog, right? I mean,
absolutely. And that's why from the beginning, I've been opposed to the fairness for all supposed movements, because it really doesn't mean fairness for all. It means fairness for the people we are in the room with negotiating. And it means the abrogation of religious liberty for everybody else.
And for that matter, not just,
housing, public accommodations,
outside, but then the sports, the medicine, the private facilities, and I've formed friendships with some secular radical feminists who don't agree with you or me or anything else, but they agree with us that biology isn't bigotry, and that a man who identifies as a woman isn't actually a woman,
right,
and therefore shouldn't be in women's only spaces or women's only programs. And I think that's important. That's common grace, right? In our natural law, in my tradition, common grace in your tradition. And you don't need to have special revelation to see that. And I think it's important for us to, when we can make those partnerships, let's do it without compromising other things. If we agreed to disagree about gay marriage, and we're like, look, we're just not going to talk about gay marriage right now. We're going to talk about something else where we do agree. And I think that was, I think it's going to be important for our continued success in a pluralistic country that we can form those sorts of relationships.
I just want to interject that Protestants also believe in natural law. We're not going to define it the same way that that you are, but at the same time, don't dismiss Protestant concern with natural law.
Yep.
And it isn't.
One of your professors and one of my newest fellows, Andrew's a great expert on this. He's working on a new book manuscript on kind of an evangelical approach to natural law thinking. And I think that's a hugely important project. And I look forward to learning from Andrew and kind of, some of the both evangelical ways in which he can embrace it and critique it as a intellectual tradition.
So my first real theological wrestling with natural law in public came with one of the men who was very involved in the founding of EPPC, which is Carl Henry.
Yeah.
And we developed a paper together back in the early 1990s on this. And, and neither one of us had to do that before. It's interesting, Dr. Henry was then in his 80s and it was already something he had to deal with. I was just beginning public life and ministry and really had to deal with it. But what we came up with as evangelical Protestants committed even to sola scriptura, of course, is that the natural law can never be the ultimate authority for Protestants, but it is a part of the creation order, and it is both illustrative of and prior to politics. Mm-hmm. It is illustrative of God's creative intention, and it's pre-political and accessible to all. And so again, we could differ about that, but it turns out it's very, very important. But it also turns out that it gets you in trouble. And I'm talking to the man who right now is probably in more trouble over this than anyone else on the planet. So I want to turn to that. Your latest book is not available at Amazon.com. Just tell us the story.
Sure. I mean, so, when the book came out, you were very nice. You had me on the show. We talked about the book. It's titled When Harry Became Sally. It was meant to kind of show how quickly our culture had changed from when Harry met Sally, the big cultural question where men and women are so different. Can they just be friends?
Right.
Today, men and women, it's a fluid concept and it's a spectrum, and you could be somewhere. Like it just shows you how quickly in the cultural discussion we went from taking sex differences seriously to almost denying that they exist. Right. Gender is now the term, and it's a spectrum and it's fluid. The book came out 3 years ago. Amazon happily sold the book for 3 years. Once President Trump was no longer in office, once Attorney General Barr was no longer the AG, once Josh Hawley was no longer a Senate majority, on a Sunday afternoon about a month ago, the book just disappeared. And it was the Sunday before the House of Representatives was scheduled to vote on the Equality Act. The book, there's a large chapter in the book discussing the Equality Act and the problems with it. I'm probably one of the more outspoken critics of the Equality Act. So the timing is hugely suspicious. The timing, both the weekend before the vote, the timing of why only now do they claim the book violates their content policy. It didn't violate their content policy for 3 years. And then Amazon is not just like the mom and pop bookstore down the street. Amazon controls something like 70% of all new adult book sales, 80% of all ebook sales. They are the market. And so what this means, it's not just, how will it impact my personal book sales or my professional reputation? I think clearly part of this is meant to damage my professional reputation. But I think about this as an ecosystem. Think about this as a system. What future young scholar is going to say, I'm going to write a book if they're afraid that they're going to run afoul of the Amazon censor? What future publisher is going to take a risk publishing that book, especially if they aren't prominent enough to get the type of media attention that I was fortunate to get, because other people's books are going to be canceled and you and I will never even hear about it. And then other people just won't write books in the first place. Other publishers won't publish.
That's how cultural coercion works. And and it's not accidental. People know what they're doing. And I don't like the phrase cancel culture because it's just used whenever someone disagrees these days. But we're actually talking about the disappearance of books. We're talking about the absence of arguments. We're talking about the subversion of discourse. And your book is not the first, probably, but it's the first to be this prominent because, frankly, of your role and the book having influence over the last 3 years. Amazon's articulated a new policy that they're not going to publish any materials in which there is the claim that anything covered by LGBTQ is somehow the result of mental illness. So it raises a host of questions with me, like, what about Freud? Because as I recall, Sigmund Freud, though acknowledging something like a homosexual sexual orientation and making statements that, normalize it to some extent, he also spoke of it as a psychological inversion. When he tried to explain it, I don't know where this goes. I mean, your average liberal of the 1980s was making similar kinds of arguments. I don't know if their books are going to disappear as well.
Yeah. So the Amazon lawyer who wrote that letter that went to the 4 senators who had asked questions about this, the exact phrase was, we now have a policy where we don't sell books that, quote, frame LGBTQ identities as mental illnesses. And there's just a couple of things to say there. One is that the book never frames the identity as a mental illness, right? So it does talk about gender dysphoria, which is a psychiatric condition, according to the most recent edition of the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, right? So the DSM-5, which Amazon sells, lists gender dysphoria as one of the diagnoses there. But again, it doesn't talk about LGBTQ identities. They used that phrase intentionally. Amazon did. Thing is, it says mental illnesses. I never use that phrase in my own voice. The book, it shows up once when I'm quoting the former psychiatrist in chief at Johns Hopkins. And the reason I don't use that phrase myself is because of the way that I do frame it. I frame gender dysphoria as being similar to other dysphorias, such as anorexia. And I think all of us would agree that a high school girl with anorexia has nothing wrong with her body, and so she doesn't need liposuction. Right. But I also think all of us would agree that we wouldn't refer to that high school girl as mentally ill, because there's a certain stigma and pathologizing, around the concept of mental illness. And so we wouldn't refer to her as like, she's mentally ill, which is why I don't do it on gender dysphoria. And so they've actually, they've libeled me in 2 senses, right? Saying that I framed the book as one of mental illness, and it's about the identity of the person, not the actual psychiatric condition. And I think this is going to have huge consequences for them. What I mean by that is that what they've done here is they've intentionally misrepresented the nature of the book, because they know that for someone who knows nothing about me and nothing about the book, they're going to think, oh, this is a bomb-throwing red meat book. He's calling gay people crazy, right? Which is the way that, the critics that you and I share try to describe us. Now we have a vice president of Amazon repeating that smear in a letter to 4 senators, right? I mean, we shouldn't be pretending we don't see what's really going on. What they're really doing here is trying to present the book as if it's some, right-wing nut job bomb throwing book. So anyway, we're in the process of that,
by the way, online booksellers don't sell those.
Right. But there's no consistency here. I mean, this is where we should also realize that this was intentional, targeted to try to kneecap someone the week before a major vote.
So where does this go from here? Or do you talk about that, or do you know?
I don't know where it's going to go from here. I do know that just last week, the Attorney General in Indiana sent a letter to Amazon opening an inquiry, requesting some information. A couple of days before that, some members of the House of Representatives had sent a letter. So now there's a Senate letter, there's a House letter, there's a state AG letter. I'm considering legal action in a personal capacity, and that's still being worked out. So I can't fully tell you where it goes from here, but I'm exploring all the options. Because I think it's really important, not just for me personally, but for conservatives as we wrestle with big tech, that we push back on these things.
Yeah. I think as you're talking about this, about the fact that if you do look at the conservative movement in the United States in the last half of the 20th century, you had someone like William F. Buckley Jr., who said, look, our arguments are not going to be published in the New Yorker or Harper's or Atlantic. So instead, we're going to start a magazine, and National Review as it became. And it will have equal access to the mails as those others. Mm-hmm. And that was a very important principle. So people could subscribe to National Review the same way they subscribe to the New Yorker or The Nation, even further on the left or anything like that. That's what's being threatened now. There is no access for conservative ideas that is protected and respected as it should be in a free society.
Yeah. So two thoughts there is that one is that in the 1980s, someone like Buckley could say that, the biggest threat to our liberty was big government. Right. I think in the 2020s, we need to see that both big government and big tech, big business, big tech can threaten it. And then the second thought is that, you mentioned that, Buckley could start a magazine, and he knew that a common carrier, the U.S. Postal Service, would deliver his magazine. We're now seeing something that strikes me as it's at the intersection of antitrust law and monopoly law, common carrier, public utility law, and then maybe non-discrimination law. And what Twitter, Facebook, Google, Amazon, it strikes me that they're right at the intersection. They don't perfectly fit in either of those buckets, but they're kind of right where the three buckets meet. And we have to think about, what would it mean if your internet service provider said, oh, you're a conservative Southern Baptist, we don't provide you with internet access anymore. What does that mean for your podcast, for your daily radio show, for all the... Or
just the average Christian in business or in school.
Yeah. If the banks, there's certain banks that have told certain nonprofits, we won't let you have checking accounts here any longer. I think conservatives need to recognize that there's a threat to our freedom, our liberty, and our flourishing that comes from big government and from woke capitalism. And we need to think through what the proper legal response is.
That's right. And when you mentioned big government, and you're exactly right, historically, that was the big concern and fear of conservatives. Now you're looking at big tech. I guess you could say that Huxley and Orwell and Jacques Ellul and others certainly saw this coming when others did not. But it's interesting right now to ask, just take big tech and big government. Which one's more afraid of the other right now? I think in a lot of ways, big government's more afraid of big tech than big tech is of big government.
And I think you might have seen that earlier this week in South Dakota.
Yep. So much to talk about. I am so thankful that you're the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, Ryan Anderson. We've had many conversations in the past. I look forward to many in the future. I pray for and look for good things from EPPC under your leadership. I'm thankful for it.
Thank you. I appreciate your support and this conversation.
Many thanks to my guest, Ryan Anderson, for thinking with me today. If you enjoyed today's episode of Thinking in Public, you will find more than 150 of these conversations at albertmohler.com under the tab Thinking in Public. For information on the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, go to spts.edu. For information on Boyce College, go to boycecollege.com. Thank you for joining me for Thinking in Public. And until next time, keep thinking. I'm Albert Mohler.